Hello and welcome to the Perusia podcast. I'm Charbel, Raish, your host, and very excited to introduce you to our guest who's been on a couple of times now. But it is Father Robert Spitzer, and he's the founder of the Marja Center and an apostolate that's really aimed at bringing the truth to science, faith, and reason, and looking at how science complements our faith, and looking at evidence for God's existence and evidence for the soul and evidence for so many great supernatural things. Today's topic, we're going to talk about the Shroud of Turin and also its link with the resurrection of Christ. And so let's dive into that today. I think it's a great topic as we lead into Lent and prepare for Easter. So let's welcome Father now. Hello, Father. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Charbel. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thanks for joining us. It's been amazing just learning and discovering more and more of what you're doing at the Marja Center and Credible Catholic. Very, very quickly, just to sum up for those who are not familiar with the Marja Center, what exactly do you do there and how can people get involved?
The Marja Center is oriented predominantly at giving resources that can be used for various topics of evangelization. But most of our work is in the area of intellectual evangelization, intellectual conversion. And we do have resources for spiritual and moral conversion. And we have much fuller resources in spiritual and moral conversion on the way. But right now, Marja Center is very, very oriented toward intellectual conversion, as you so well put it, oriented toward the evidence for God from science and philosophy, the evidence for a transphysical soul that'll survive bodily death from science and philosophy. Also, we look at the historical evidence, and we look at the scientific evidence for Jesus and his resurrection, some of which we're going to be talking about today with respect to the Shroud of Turin. And I might point out that there's some videos on our Marja's website there that you can just click on it. You go to the section, the landing page. It's called Jesus, the Reality of Jesus, and just click on the free resources, and there you'll see a video on the Shroud of Turin, similar to what I'll be talking about today. And then also we give resources too for the church. Contemporary miraculous phenomena, including Eucharistic miracles and the Marian miracles. And we also take a look at what we call our 4 levels of happiness or purpose in life, and why would an all-loving God allow suffering, and how to suffer well through your faith. So that's what Marja does. Credible Catholic, which is crediblecatholic.com. We put it into a form that can be used by teachers and students and parents. So this is really oriented, crediblecatholic.com is really oriented toward young people and giving resources to teachers and parents and students, about how to solidify their faith. So we've got, PowerPoint modules that are oriented, voiceover PowerPoints that you can just download onto your computer, show them to your kids if you're a teacher or a parent. And the kids, of course, can always look at video stream online and just look at it as well. We've got a whole bunch of resources, but I would recommend that people just going to the website and wanting to get the basic knowledge of what's there. If you just, when you get onto crediblecatholic.com, click on the 7 essential modules. And once you click on there, you'll see these 7 modules, the ones I just mentioned, existence of God, existence, evidence of Jesus, evidence of a soul, etc. All those modules are separated out in 7 parts, and they're totally self-contained. You don't have to be a scientific expert. Our objective is to have teachers facilitate these videos. We can answer questions of various kinds. We have a whole new resource coming online called the 91 Most Asked Questions. And we put their little 8-minute answers to all of the thorny ones, if God, created everything, what created God, etc., all the way to the questions about the church, particular moral issues, etc. So all that is there, and will be there, and it just helps out our young people, so that and helps out especially our teachers, our catechists, our parents, who are really trying to convey this to our kids. Make no mistake about it, 42% of kids are very likely, who are now practicing believers, by the time they're getting out of college, you can depend on this. They will not be believers. They will be unbelievers. They're not going to just leave the church. They're going to leave faith in God altogether. They will be thoroughgoingly propagandized by atheistic and agnostic websites, which are now very prolific. And a lot of kids just buy into it, but there's no reason to, because the evidence for God, the soul, for Jesus, the church is overwhelmingly good. More evidence from science and philosophy today than ever before in the history of humankind for God, the soul, and Jesus. So that's our point, is to prevent kids from jumping off the cliff, because once they go into the agnostic or atheistic abyss, honestly, really hard to get them back off of it. If you can prevent the jump, you save yourself just a lifetime of pain and prayer, trying to bring them back into the faith. But evidence is needed, and evidence we got.
Praise be to God. That sounds amazing. Absolutely amazing. I congratulate you on preparing all that in such a systematic way and easy to digest and access. The amazing thing about everything you said there, for those who want to know more, is you can go on the website and it's absolutely free to access these resources. Free. This is phenomenal. And thank you for doing it this way. So teachers, parents, and students can access all this absolutely free at Credible Catholic and at Margis Center. We'll have the links below as well. Amazing work, Father. That's great. I am looking forward to the release of a special module of yours for our academy later on in the year, and we can talk more about that at closer to the date on release. But really excited about bringing that to our future teachers for the adult education program, the Parousia Academy Certificate for Mission. So very excited about the course that you'll be doing for us there as well. Now, Father, you ready to dive in this topic? The Shroud of Turin. This is a personal one for me. I have to say this at the start. My conversion happened, my encounter with Christ was in the tabernacle. It was on the door of the tabernacle that I saw this shadow appear. And on that shadow, I later discovered was the Shroud of Turin. And I have to show, I've just released my book just in 2020. And I've deliberately put on the front cover in the middle, the Shroud of Turin, which is the face I saw in the tabernacle, and I also have the mosque and the church there, just to show where my influence, how Islam led me back to Christ. But I deliberately wanted everyone to see the Shroud of Turin, because that's the face I saw, and I don't remember seeing that face before I saw it on the tabernacle. When I later discovered what it was, blown away, and I'd love love to learn. I'm just excited about sharing this for people, and it's very relevant now as we begin the journey of Lent and leading up to Easter. It's the resurrection of Christ, and that's the hope that we have. Although we go through pain and suffering, fasting and almsgiving and penance, there is hope at the end. And so Jesus, although dies on Good Friday, we know that he rises on Easter Sunday, and this shroud is rock solid evidence that we can say that he actually did rise from the dead. So love to dive in now and tell us a little bit about the Shroud of Turin. Why is it called the Shroud of Turin? We know, what is it?
Well, first of all, it's a 14-foot linen cloth, 14 feet by about 3¼ feet. It's a linen cloth. It has a very complex, expensive weave. It definitely comes from antiquity, from around the Middle East in that area. And it is thought to be the burial cloth of Jesus because it contains two remarkable things. Number one, it has blood on it, and we're absolutely certain that it's blood. And that blood corresponds perfectly to the gospel accounts of Jesus's crucifixion. The blood has hemoglobin in it, AB positive blood type. That'll be more relevant in a moment. It also has a partial DNA profile. And in addition to that, it has an admixture of ferritin and creatinine, which are two enzymes that fuse together and synthesize when somebody undergoes a polytrauma. So, which of course this man would have. Now, all this is going to be important to test the the theory that it could have been produced by a medieval forger, but I'll go over the evidence again. It also, the blood has a serum to plasma ratio that shows that the body was oriented on a vertical axis for quite some time as the blood was dripping before it was placed in the shroud. So that's the first amazing part, is the blood on the shroud. But the second, which is much more important with respect to the resurrection, is the image on the shroud. That's the really remarkable dimension. This, as we'll see, is the most unique image in the history of all artifacts in the entire world for all time. It has undergone more scientific testing, and it has like 123 different tests. And among all of these things, the shroud has come up smelling like a rose. I'll get to the dating of the shroud, the carbon dating of the shroud in 1988 in a moment. But for the time being, that testing has all been absolutely 100% positive. But here's the deal. That image, as we will talk about, has to be produced by a tremendous burst of light. And I'll be talking about the evidence for this. And that would be in the order of about 6 to 8 billion watts of magnitude. That's with a B, billion, like 500,000 searchlights worth of light energy emanating from every three-dimensional point in this man's body. That's, by the way, highly unusual for corpses to do. And so for all intents and purposes, we've got really a testimony to a miracle, but I need to detail that evidence in a moment. But what's important now for the moment is that the blood was on the shroud before the image was. Wow. And this is easily detectable because, you know, the actual blood acts also as a kind of a recipient of the image with that kind of a light volume. And so we can actually see the image projected on the blood itself. So we know that there was no artist sketch on top of which blood was placed, but rather the blood is there without any kind of a sketch or image, and then the image comes over it. The same sequence that would have happened if that body had been authentically placed in a shroud, and then the light burst thereafter. So hang on to all that. It's truly amazing, but that's the Shroud of Turin. And it unfortunately appeared to us in the 1300s with Geoffroy de Charnay in Liry, France. And that's a difficulty because people say, well, how can you be so sure that it came from Jerusalem or northern Judea? We can be absolutely sure of it. And I'll talk about the evidence that it came from Jerusalem and Judea in a moment. And I'll talk about the corresponding history that enables us to, as it were, trace the evidence of where the shroud was from pollen fossils on the cloth, and then look at that compared with where the Mandylion, and I'll talk about that word in a moment, appeared in the history of humankind in Edessa, Turkey, Constantinople, and so forth. So this is the fascinating Shroud of Turin. Do I think it is the burial cloth of Jesus? Well, as a scientific person, I have to say that I can only be 99.99% sure, because every scientific hypothesis has to be negatable. It has to be falsifiable. So I'll keep with my principle, but I think there is so much evidence that I will present today that I hope you will be 99.9% sure too, and leave the 0.1% for those who require scientific falsifiability.
Wow, fantastic. Oh, there is a mouthful there, and let's go through this. I mean, it might be good. You've clarified what the Shroud of Turin is not. So it's not a painting. It's not a photocopy of an image. No. The evidence that we're going to dive into now will show that with the light, the amount of power, electricity that you described there has created this, which is very unlikely for someone to even deliberately do, and back in that time as well. Yeah. Very curious to see how we can go through these things one by one. So where to begin now with the evidence? Should we start with the dating first, or where's the best place to start? Maybe there.
Yeah, I think, because of that 1988 carbon dating, a lot of people think, oh, that shroud, it's a fraud. They dated it to the 15th century and 1988, and that's all there is to that, right? And so wrong. They did, in fact, date it to the 15th century in 1988, but they didn't date it, namely the
Mm.
linen shroud. They dated a strand that was taken from the linen shroud, and that strand came from a place that was very heavily burned in the fire of Chambéry. And in that fire, some silver from the little, box that the shroud was in, that the silver melted and fell down upon the shroud. So if you look at the shroud's image, you can see on both sides there's kind of these lines that are going down, and this, places where the shroud obviously got burned in that fire. By the way it was folded, the silver penetrated all the way through. And so you can see it. Well, these sisters in the 15th century, they didn't want to leave holes in the shroud, right? This beloved shroud. So they took cotton fibers, cotton threads, right? And they dyed it with a gum dye mordant that was white. And they used a technique called invisible mending. And they actually mended together with the dyed cotton that looks very similar to the linen, but very easily detectable which one it is by thermochemical analysis, right? But they wove it right into the shroud there, and then patched it up, and then put a cover. I mean, not a cover, but a backing on the back of the shroud, and sewed it in with the same technique. Well, the strand was removed from that burnt section that would have had, no question, the invisible mending. Now, that was a violation of the protocols that were required in 1978 by what was called the STIRP protocols, the Shroud of Turin Research Project protocols, which required 7 different samples be taken from 7 different parts of the linen cloth, not from the burnt part of the cloth that could have other particles or other kinds of fibers blended in there. Well, for whatever reason in 1988, that strand was removed from that very controversial corner of the shroud, right where there was a patching that was obviously done. Some people could almost be inclined to think that, gee, the people who did this were really trying to get a bogus reading on the carbon dating, but far be it from me to point the finger at fraud. But it has, in a court of law, a lot of fingerprints of something like that, because they avoided all the legitimate places on the shroud to take a sample from. I mean, I'm not sure I get this whole thing, but anyway, here's what happens in the rest of the story. In 1998, a thermochemist by the name of Dr. Ray Rogers, who is, by the way, he was at Los Alamos, laboratory, which is the nuclear observatory that built the atomic bomb. He was down there, and he's a big-time researcher and the head of a research area of thermochemistry, and the head of a research journal called Thermochemica. Dr. Ray Rogers became acquainted with the shroud prior to that and was part of the Shroud of Turin research project. But when the carbon dating came in, he never examined the place where the strand was taken. He believed that everything was on the up and up when the sample was taken, and so he believed the results unquestioningly. However, because of 2 individuals who came along who were interested in the actual thread content and so forth and so on, most especially one guy, Len Marino, there were these sticky tapes taken throughout the 1978 STIRP investigation. And so for like every kind of few millimeters, they have a sticky tape, right, that they've put on the shroud and identified the exact place that these sticky tapes came from on the shroud. So when you correlate the sticky tape from the area that the strand was taken from, and that sticky tape is independent, right? What does the sticky tape reveal from the very spot where that strand for the sample of the carbon dating was taken from? Cotton fibers. And not only does it reveal cotton fibers, but cotton fibers that had a gum dye mordant, almost as if somebody deliberately chose a strand that would be, well, older, not older, but younger than could possibly have been imagined. But anyway, they found the cotton content. There's no cotton content in the actual shroud. It's a pure linen shroud, no cotton content. So the fact that this sticky tape is revealing all these cotton fibers, and that the fibers had been dyed with a white dye to look similar to the shroud, and using a gum dye mordant that was only available after the 11th century in Europe. Hello, this is telltale signs of a bad sample. And so Dr. Ray Rogers at that time said, hey, this sample is invalid for dating the shroud. We have to go back to the original protocol of 7 different samples. But then another fellow by the name of Dr. Tristan Casabianca, he came along and he said, hey, I want to get that raw data from the carbon dating, because you can actually, with the raw data, you can do a statistical analysis to see whether there's stratification, variegation. People want to know what these are. Sure, they're explained in that, if you go to that article called Science in the Shroud of Turin, right off the Maggia Center website, Science in the Shroud of Turin, just go to maggiacenter.com, click on free resources, get that article. You can get all the processes.
We'll put that in the link below.
Oh, perfect. And then the third test that was done was a mechanical compressibility and tension test. And finally, the fourth one that was done is a vanillin test. That's an enzyme that, that decays over the course of time, that's generally embedded in linen or linen cloths of a similar nature to the shroud. So when you take those tests and you kind of average out all the test results from the 4 of them, it gives rise to a date of about 50 AD, plus or minus about 150 years, with a 95% confidence level.
Wow.
So there's just no way this shroud came from the 15th century. I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg that shows that this shroud did not originate there. But the other tests pretty conclusively prove that. But then there's 3 external areas. We might call them sort of an indirect form of evidence, right? That also testify to the early date of the shroud. The first thing are those pollen fossils I mentioned a little earlier. Now, the pollen fossils are important because there are pollens that are indigenous to particular regions, and it's the quantity of the pollen fossils plus the uniqueness to particular regions. Well, if you take a look at the shroud, and Swiss criminologist Dr. Max Frey did this and categorized just huge numbers of pollen fossils embedded in the shroud. Well, the place with the largest quantity was Jerusalem and northern Judea. Just saying. Not only that, but there are 6 pollen fossils that are indigenous to Jerusalem and northern Judea, and 4 pollen fossils have never been found beyond northern Judea anywhere in the world. So, I mean, that gives pretty clear evidence it was in Jerusalem, and probably in Jerusalem for a long time, and that's where it originated. Then again, I'll talk about this later, it went to Edessa, Turkey. That's the next largest number of pollen fossils, with 3 pollens that are indigenous to that area. And then to Constantinople, a little, ways further away from Edessa, and I can talk about the history of how that happened. And then finally, we get the least number of pollen fossils are from Liry, France, where it showed up with Geoffroy de Charnay, and also in Turin, Italy, where the shroud remains today. That's the least number. So that gives you a little sense of that journey that the shroud has been on. But interestingly enough, the shroud, the configuration of the pollen fossils that are found in the shroud are so fossilized that they are normally found in strata of the earth, so you can measure dates by going down deeper and deeper according to strata, technique called stratigraphy that was invented, by the way, by a Danish Catholic priest. So just for the
Another one,
fun of
another
it, yeah,
priest, scientist.
yeah, Nicholas Dano, Dr. Nicholas Dano, and also Bishop Nicholas Dano. And in any case, the long and short of it is they come from very early on, way before anything like the 15th century. So we could probably fairly date it to about the 7th century AD, somewhere in that neighborhood, but probably much earlier than that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, strangely enough, on the man's eyes, you can see 2 Roman leptons. Well, that's not unusual, because people in Jerusalem or people in Israel at the time would generally take some Roman coins. If a man's eyes came open right during the process of dying, they would just close the eyes and put these 2 little Roman coins that are about, let's say, a third of the size of one of our pennies, put them on the man's eyes to hold them down, to keep them closed. So that wasn't unusual. But remember, we'll talk about light forming the image. Inasmuch as light formed the image and not a chemical, not a vapor, etc., then it wouldn't be totally unusual for the image of the coin that's on the man's lids to also be projected along with the image of the body as well. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. The coin's image comes right up onto the shroud. And what is even more interesting is that those coins have 4 enigmas in them. That is to say, they're different from other Roman leptons minted in Rome at the period. And these 4 enigmas are very obvious. We have searched every numismatic collection in the world, and we have found that we simply do not have any others that did not originate in 29 AD in a special minting by Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. Let me repeat that. These Roman leptons came from a minting in 29 AD by Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. And they're sitting right there in the man's. I'm sure a medieval forger went ahead and got 2 of these coins to protect the authenticity of his fraud. I don't want a middle guy in the Middle Ages even know. So I mean, it starts to get less and less likely. And then when you compare, the last thing just kills everything. It's the Facecloth of Oviedo. Now, there's another relic, which is as interesting in many respects as the Shroud of Turin, and it's the Facecloth of Oviedo. And this cloth shows up. We have a provenance that goes back to 616 AD. And that provenance we've got very strict records from ecclesiastical authorities like archbishops going right up to the time of the 700s. In the 700s, the Facecloth of Oviedo is presented to Isidore of Seville, a good, credible witness, who places it, or it builds a special little sanctuary for the Facecloth of Oviedo in Oviedo, Spain, obviously, in the cathedral there in Oviedo, Spain, where it was put and where it remains to this very day. So we've got a very established provenance going to 616 AD. So you're thinking, so what about that? What's so special about that? There are 120 bloodstains on that face cloth. I'll explain what the face cloth is in a moment. Yeah. There's 120 bloodstains in that face cloth that coincide perfectly with the 120 bloodstains that are on the facial part of the image on the Shroud of Turin. So if you look at the Shroud of Turin, you'll see 120 irregularly shaped blood stains all over this man's face, the top of his head, the back of his head, going all the way down to the nape of his neck. You can see all of them. There are about 70 on the front part, and then about 50 blood stains on the back part. Now, there's no image at all on the face cloth of Oviedo. And you'll see the significance in a moment. because these bloodstains, if you do what's called digital overlay photography, right? So you take a picture of those unusual bloodstains when the face cloth is spread out in a particular fashion, oriented, right, for what would happen, because the face cloth is put around and then it goes over the top of the head down the back of the neck. So you kind of have to straighten it out so that it will have the same conformity as the front and the back of the shroud. But you put a digital overlay of the front part of the shroud with the front part of the face cloth, back part of the shroud with the back part of the face cloth, you get a perfect coincidence. Do you know what the odds are of producing an exact replica of those bloodstains on one of the cloths that doesn't even have an image of a face on it, and getting a perfect coincidence with all those irregularly configured bloodstains? It's simply astronomically improbable.
Wow.
I mean, that you could do this, except in one case where the two cloths touched the same
Of course.
face. Now, if that happened, then that would be very explicable. Everything else is nuts. So to make a long story short, the only plausible scientific hypothesis that we have is that the two claws definitely touch the same face, the same top of the head, and the same back of the head that corresponds to the Shroud of Turin. Well, wait a minute. We've got a provenance that's established to 616 AD for the Facecloth of Oviedo. Then how could the Shroud of Turin have been produced by a medieval forger in the 15th century?
Well, really.
Impossibile. I will never believe a carbon dating that does not get the shroud back to at least 616 AD, because I don't think it's even remotely possible to explain the coincidence of those bloodstains. But that's my opinion. And by the way, it's not just the bloodstains. The pleural edema fluid that is leaking out of the nose and the spittle that is coming out of the side of the mouth, all identical. All of the liquid profusions are identical. Now, you know, what's a face cloth? So,
Yes,
right,
I was going to ask that.
that is a perfectly good question. So, but anyway, the long and short of it, face cloth was used by the people in first century Judea when, let's say, a body had a particularly macabre configuration of the face, where there was looked like even the person was beaten, or there's degeneration of the face, and they wanted to honor the dead person. They didn't want the jaw to be flopping. Let's say when they're bringing the body from the crucifixion scene to the tomb, the jaw would have been by that time just flopping. The fluids would have been coming out of the nose. The face would have been absolutely macabre. And if you loved this man, there's just no way you would not cover that face with what they typically did at Facecloth. And they had this particular way of wrapping it and so forth, putting it on the face. And then when they get to the tomb, they would take it off the face. Then they would wash the face, but I'll talk about not washing in a moment. And so this face was not washed, but normally they would wash the face and then put the body in the burial shroud. Now, we know from John's gospel, right, that you remember when Peter and John go zooming down to the tomb, the younger one, John, who gets there first, peers in and sees what? He sees the face cloth rolled up and separately put into a place by itself. And then he looks over and sees the burial cloth. So if you just go down there to John 20, you'll see, right, that the cloth is separated off in a place by itself. Now that's, I'm not kidding. I think this is exactly what happened. Both of these cloths are taken, but they're taken by two different groups of apostles, and when, of course, the invasion comes, when Rome is thrown out of, when the Jewish temple is destroyed and Rome invades and comes into Jerusalem and takes over, somehow these cloths get separated, but it stays still in the Jerusalem, Judea area, but not in a place where anyone can get their clutches on it. So the main thing, though, is we have a real provenance, and I just think the dating question, did the shroud come from before the 616 AD? Yes. I mean, that's where the coins come from. That's where the pollen fossils are suggestively coming from. That's where the four other dating tests seem to suggest that it comes right from around the area of about 50 AD. So I think it's overwhelming evidence that this carbon dating was not only wrong, well, might have been deliberately wrong, though I do not want to push the point, because of course, who would want to do something like that? Anyway, that's the story of the dating.
This is just one aspect of what we were talking about, dating, and you've just
Yeah.
gone through so much detail there to just show just how implausible it is for this to be younger than what
Yeah.
we're saying here.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't know up until this point about that the cloth that goes around the head. Can you describe just the process there? Then this shroud is a burial cloth that goes over the front and the back of the dead corpse, and then
Yeah.
this other cloth is put on the head.
Around it,
And
yeah.
is that then taken off typically? Then the shroud is put on, or
Yeah.
could they stay? So could you describe the process here? What was going on?
Sure. So what they want to do is they want to solidify the jaw. They want to,
Mm-hmm.
capture the liquid profusion. So when they're taking him off the cross, and I'll talk about why I think he was on the cross in a moment, because you can tell from the blood stains, which I'll get to momentarily. But when they're taking him off, they put the face cloth on him. Then they transport him to the tomb.
Mm-hmm.
Then they take the cloth off of his face.
Okay.
Now, normally, you would wash the body and then place them in the linen cloth. So the body is placed on the linen cloth. So the cloth is laid on the deck that's inside that tomb, and the body is placed on the deck with his back down. Then that's on 7 feet of the cloth, and then the other 7 feet is taken and it's just put over the top of the body, and then sealed at the feet, and then it's gone. So why this body, of all the Jewish bodies who didn't get washed, why this one? Because we know from the gospel accounts that the Passover was near. They couldn't violate the Passover, so they had to get the body into the tomb, get it into the shroud, get the tomb sealed before sundown. So obviously they were in a big rush, which explains a whole lot of things about this image that wouldn't be found on other images. In other words, luckily they were in a big rush, because now all the blood stains remained.
Yes.
And this is really important to our investigation. But yes, we do have evidence from John's Gospel that the Facecloth of Ovido is right there, rolled up and is lying in a place by itself.
Amazing. Now, it might be important to know then, how do we track the history? So what took place, it's you described earlier, it moved around country to country, and we only really started testing it recently, but there was that first patchwork done in the 1500s or 15th century. But what was going on in the first then 1500s? So can we track what would have happened from resurrection? We've got this cloth, we've got this shroud. Where did it go from there? Would it have stayed in Jerusalem? Did the apostles keep it? Then when they died, did it stay with some? How did it move around from there? It'd be fascinating to know. Do we have any idea of how it got to Turin, the journey from Jerusalem to Turin?
Yeah, we do. We actually do. You have to put together the history, but here's how most of our scholars put it together. For about, let's say till about 270, maybe around 300, the shroud remained in not necessarily Jerusalem, probably in northern Judea. So once the apostles are, trying to start the new church, contend with things, they take these two cloths, and they probably, because the pollen fossils, by the way, on the Facecloth of Oviedo and the Shroud of Turin are almost identical, even the unique and indigenous ones. So then it stays there till about 270, maybe 300 AD, right around that neighborhood in northern Judea. Then suddenly they move it to Edessa. So something obviously happened that caused the church there in Jerusalem or northern Judea to say, hey, wait a minute, these cloths could get confiscated or could, be destroyed. So they obviously move it to Edessa, Turkey. Now, we know that it goes to Edessa because, remember, the proliferation of pollen fossils, the largest number are from Jerusalem and northern Judea. The second largest number is Edessa, Turkey. But that's not the only identifiable feature, right? Because there's unique and indigenous ones to pollen fossils to Edessa that are also embedded in the shroud. Obviously not forgeries, because nobody did those classifications before the 20th century. So the idea then would be to say, okay, it stays in Edessa, and we know when it goes out of Edessa to Constantinople. But anyway, it's in Edessa from the pollen fossils, but something happens in Edessa right at that time. There is a relic called the Mandylion. And the Mandylion is a face of a man, and it's said to be the face of Jesus Christ. And it's in a big wooden frame. And so this wooden frame is there, and it's got this life-size face, in it. And of course, it's protruding, right? I mean, they didn't have the glass in front of the wood, it's just inside the wooden frame. Well, we know that the shroud was in a wooden frame, and it was folded so that the face would be facing outward, but not exposing the rest of the body on the shroud. Because in all those tests I mentioned, the scientific tests, you can actually see in the various there are different kinds of spectral photography that were done on the shroud, and you can actually see the creases that are still there. And if you look at those creases and you just configure them appropriately, you can see exactly how the face was the shroud was folded, which puts the face on the shroud right out to the front, right? Hides the rest of the body. Now, and we know that when it was put in that frame, the frame was closed, and it kind of crushed the shroud so that the creases were very, very permanent, because we know it was in that frame for a good 300 years. So and why do we know that the Mandylion is very likely the Shroud of Turin with the face, just the face part of the Shroud of Turin? How do we know? We know because the iconography of Jesus changed radically from a little town. Well, at that time, Edessa was a center of commerce. And so it wasn't a little town, but it was a moderate sized town. It wasn't a Constantinople or something like that. But anyway, we know that this is where the iconographic changes occurred, because previously Jesus's icons had been on a very round-faced Roman person, right? Whereas now, suddenly the icons come and they're with, an elongated face, right? And a thinner elongated face. Secondly, prior to Edessa, we can see that the iconography of Jesus has very short Roman haircut, right? Very close to cropped hair. Suddenly, we now get icons where Jesus has very long hair, and in fact has very long hair resembling that on the Shroud of Turin. Thirdly, the iconography before Edessa, no beard, right? Romans were clean shaven. And then all of a sudden, you've got a beard, and it looks very much like the beard on the Shroud of Turin. And then there are about 20 scar marks. There are marks that are on the Shroud of Turin, and they start appearing in icons that go back to 5th century Edessa, Turkey. So we, by the way, this Frenchman, Paul Vignon, put all of this evidence together, and it was really quite remarkable indeed. And so we see this evidence is very, very clear that, the Mandylion was definitely the Shroud of Turin. We see the creases. We see the change in the iconography that goes back to Edessa. Very, very likely the Shroud and the Mandylion are one. Now, what happened? What happened was that in about, I think it was the 900s, the emperor there in Constantinople decided he wanted this relic. So he laid siege to Edessa. He just wouldn't let, he surrounded Edessa, frankly, with Eastern Roman troops, and basically said, tell you what, I've got an offer for you. It's a very fair offer. I'm going to give you the equivalent of a few $100,000, in money, and I'm going to take this relic. That's a nice exchange. But if you don't, I'll strangle you. So, of course, the king of Edessa says, well, that sounds like a fair offer, and just release us from the siege and give me the money. And he gave it up. So we know that the Mandylion goes to Constantinople. Then we see, starting in about the 12th century, these crusaders that are zooming around, right? They're, all over the place there in the Middle East. We see one of them, Robert de Clary. He comes along, and he claims in a letter that he sends back to France at the time, I have seen the cloth of Jesus's burial. He says it. He said, it is in a frame with the face showing, but in reality, it is the front and the back of the body. And I saw it hanging up where? In the treasury rooms there of the cathedral, of the emperor at Constantinople. And so all of a sudden, we begin to get these impressions that there it is, the Mandylion, the face part of it, which was called the Mandylion, is really the Shroud of Turin. Now, around, in the Fourth Crusade, at some point, as you know, one of the disgraces of all time for the Western Church, the Western Crusaders came into Constantinople and said, hey, let us in, we're your brothers, and of course plundered the city and stole all the relics, and led to a division between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics till this very day. But in any case, one of the people who was a leader in the Fourth Crusade was a fellow by the name of Othon de la Roche. Well, make a very long story short. This leader of the crusade happens to be the 5th generation ancestor of Jeanne de Vergy. Now, Jeanne de Vergy is the wife of Geoffrey de Charnay, the very person who announces in the 1300s, I've got it, the burial cloth of Jesus. Everybody said, well, how did you get it? Because, of course, the Pope had already declared that anybody who stole relics at Constantinople was, well, not just excommunicated, but profoundly excommunicated and had to turn over all the relics. So, of course, Geoffrey de Charnay is not going to say, well, I got it from my fine relative who may have been excommunicated for stealing this relic, right? So he keeps his mouth shut, but nevertheless says, nevertheless, it's here. And people would look at this thing and they would, like yourself, have very religious experiences just by gazing upon this shroud. So there, without any scientific investigation, of course, at this point, but nevertheless, people thought this thing might really be authentic. And again, I'm going to make a real long story short. The shroud is put into a chapel at Chambéry. There's a fire at the chapel at Chambéry. The silver that I mentioned, that kind of, that went through, but the shroud image itself was safe. The bloodstains were safe, but nevertheless, it burned a little bit of the shroud along the sides. But the main part of the story is after that, the French officials that had it, in other words, Geoffrey de Charnay's family, basically gave it up to the Savoy family, who at that time had their seat at Turin, Italy, gave it up to them for, big time castles and money and things like that. So there was a transaction that took place, and off it goes to Turin, Italy, where it remains to this very day in the hands of the Savoy family. So it's still there. Now, the Vatican does have a sort of official say over what can happen and not happen, but it's still, the shroud is in the hands of the Savoy family. So that's where it is today.
Wow. Now, we have about 10 minutes to go, Father. It's gone so quick, but I do want to make sure we get in the evidence of light. Now, you talked about how this is not a painting. This is produced by almost like an explosion of light. Let's talk about that, and then I just have a final sort of closing question: the link between the shroud. I'd like to sort of see if there is a link between the veil of Veronica and there seems to be studies about the Divine Mercy image and then
Right.
there's the holy face metal. I mean, there's all these things, but I mean, we won't spend time on that. But I do want to finish with the evidence of light, and how do we know? How did this image get on this cloth?
Yeah, remember all the stuff I said about the bloodstains, because Jesus
Yes.
had a very unique crucifixion. And
Yes.
that very unique crucifixion with the crown of thorns and the spear hole and all that stuff, that's all emblazoned on the blood stain on the shroud. I mean, if the shroud is, there's no question, the shroud authentically validates the gospel accounts of Jesus's crucifixion in detail. But that's a story for another day. Let's get to the image, because it is a fascinating thing indeed. First of all, this image is a perfect three-dimensional photographic negative image on a non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. Now that's really unusual. Now, when you think about it, you think three-dimensional, explain that. I will in a moment. For the moment though, before it got to the cloth, whereas if it was a liquid, it would have been a little bit more precise, because it would have gone into the cloth and then spangled out into the fibers next door. So the key thing to remember though is this image is way, way, way too crisp and precise to be produced by anything like vapors and liquids. And certainly you can't explain how it's sitting on the uppermost surface of the cloth. So how about scorching? That's another big hypothesis. So maybe, you know, the medieval forger was putting some scorch images there, and that image is really a scorch mark. You can easily detect the scorch marks from what's called fluorescing. So if you kind of put a fluorescent light on it, there's a distinctive characteristic that identifies a burn in no time flat. Well, it doesn't exist anywhere on the shroud except on those little corners on the side where you see the shroud was burned. You can see the fluorescent, but aside from that, on the image, no fluorescing. So no scorching, no heat. Well, if it's not produced by a vapor, it's not produced by a rub, it's not produced by any chemical, it's not produced by scorching or heat, then what's left in the physical universe to explain it? You got it, light. Now that means that this perfectly crisp image sitting on the uppermost surface, could it be produced by light? Yes, it can be produced by light. Hold on to that. We have done it in the laboratory in 2010. Paulo de la Sarre was the first to do it and his team, but we'll get to that in 1 minute. The main thing is, what kind of light could produce this shroud? Well, the thing is remember, linen is non-photographically sensitive. So in other words, if you're going to turn that linen into a piece of photographic paper, which is, well, into a photographic negative, which is precisely what you're doing, you're going to have to make this super photographically sensitive, right? So, well, how much light would that require? As I already said, 6 to 8 billion with a B, billion watts. I mean, have you ever stood in front of a searchlight? You know how much light one searchlight will produce. Can you imagine taking 500,000 searchlights and just focusing it on a 14-foot piece of cloth? I'm telling you right now, that's a burst of light. I mean, it would not only.
I mean, that's an amazing amount. I mean, what was the equivalent? Have we done that before?
We'd be like about 10,000 miles away from the sun, which would, of course, fry you. But that leads to the question, hey, how could it be 6 to 8 billion watts of light and not fry the cloth? How is that possible? That, this cloth, I mean, well, here's the thing. It has to be done in 1/40 billionth of a second. So it has to be this super mega light, pulsation in 1/40 billionth of a second. And if you had it 1/40 billionth of a second longer, there would not even be a shroud. In fact, there would no longer be any carbon remnants of the shroud. You get a bunch of dispersed molecules. So, I mean, that's how much heat this would be producing. So, well, wait a minute. What kind of source can we have that would replicate that today? Laser, to be precise, an ARF excimer laser. Now, of course, it would take 14,000 ARF excimer lasers, which is more than all the ultraviolet capacity we have in the entire world right now, in every laboratory in the entire world. But nevertheless, with 14,000 ARF excimer lasers, you could produce this image. and it would have to come out of a dead body, because you can't make the laser machines, can't plant them inside the dead body. But of course, a medieval forger getting a hold of 14,000 ARF excimer lasers would be very difficult indeed. The point, of course, is this light is coming from the body for this remarkably short period of time, producing a phenomenon called vacuum ultraviolet radiation. And that pulses this thing right onto the shroud. Now, that's the first characteristic that should be noted. Now, as I said, in 2010, Paolo di Lazzaro and his team actually took cloths that had spectral reflectance similar to the linen used in the Shroud of Turin. And they got those spectral reflectance perfectly matched, then used ARF excimer lasers and did produce images of the exact similar quality, that yellowish kind of stain, perfectly crisp, right? So that if this pulsating light from 14,000 lasers had come out of every three-dimensional point in the man's body, straight upward onto the cloth and straight downward onto the cloth on the man's back, then you could have produced this perfectly precise image on a cloth with the same spectral reflectance. And, the testimony of Di Lazzaro has been confirmed now by other people who have also replicated it. So that's pretty interesting. Now, here's the second enigma on this. The second thing is that shroud, if you look carefully at the shroud, you'll see the bones, but around the bones are the flesh. Now, you know how an MRI works. It has layering in it, right? Yes. And so you can actually see MRI-like layering on the shroud, so that the flesh around the bone is in perfect three-dimensional symmetry with the bone inside. So it's like an MRI that's there. So it's not just a perfectly precise three-dimensional photographic negative image. It's a three-dimensional photographic negative image. That means that cloth either would have to penetrate at least 3/16 of an inch or more, 3/16 of an inch into the body, or the body has to go through the cloth with 3/16 of an inch or more. Now, here is the interesting thing about that phenomenon. If the cloth protrudes into it, or the body goes through it, then that body has to become mechanically transparent. That is to say, it can no longer have the feature of solidity, physical solidity. It's got to become spiritual. You have to have a spiritual body. Now, if you look at the resurrection accounts, and there's too much for me to bring out at this point, but if you look at the resurrection accounts of Jesus, what are the two features where the Christian view of the resurrection differs completely from Second Temple Judaism's view of the resurrection? First thing, Second Temple Judaism says that this is going to be a resuscitated corpse that's going to live forever. So you're going to get your physical body back, done, and that body's going to live. But Christianity says, no, it's going to become a pneumatikon soma. It's going to become a spiritual body. So that's the first mutation. The second Christian mutation, of course, is that the body is glorified. Jesus appears and everybody is bowing down in worship. Jesus appears and the apostles are identifying him as HaKurios, the Lord, which is the Greek translation of Yahweh, right? Jesus appears and the apostles are shocked and they think they're seeing a ghost. And so you look at this and you go, hey, this sounds like, wow, Jesus really did have a spiritual body, really did have a glorified body, that's shown in light with, 6 to 8 billion watts of light energy. And he's being transformed completely, not just spiritually, but transformed in every way, just as the apostles reported seeing him, and St. Paul reports seeing him after his resurrection. Now, this is really an amazing thing, because it's emblazoned on this image. And there's, to my mind, there's no other natural explanation except for what's vacuum ultraviolet radiation, at a 6 to 8 billion watts or so that can explain this thing to any degree of certainty. So long and short of it is, the Lord has kind of planted this relic in place that not only have the blood stains that prove the gospel's accounts, the accuracy of the gospel accounts of Jesus's crucifixion, But he also has put an image on there that it has the two Christian mutations of Second Temple Judaism's view of the resurrection, literally emblazoned on the cross. A resurrection in glory and light, and a resurrection that is spiritual, mechanically transparent. And so when you look at this, it's almost as if God implanted the evidence for all the scientists 2,000 years later to take a look at it. And he kind of winks and goes, gotcha.
This is phenomenal. We're only scratching the surface. I could tell there's so much more that you can say here on this whole topic. It's a course in itself, isn't it? I mean, there is more information on the website there, Credible Catholic, or is it Marja Center?
Well, if you want this article, you can go to marjacenter.com.
Yep.
You can also get a version of the article. If you click on crediblecatholic.com, instead of clicking on the 7 essential modules, click on the big book. Then go to volume 3 of the big book. So you'll see it's got 24 volumes. Just go to volume 3 and zoom down to chapter 8 of there. And there you'll see an article called Science in the Shroud of Turin. If you want a full-on video similar to the one I just gave you, then you go to marjacenter.com and you just click on free videos and resources. And there you'll see one called The Shroud of Turin. And you can click on that. Or if you want the version for the students that has all the scientific experts, not just Bob Spitzer here, but the scientific experts talking about this in little mini videos that are embedded in the voiceover PowerPoints, you go to crediblecatholic.com, you click on the 7 essential modules. Then you go to the 4th module, and that's called, the reality of Jesus. When you get on the 4th module, just click it. The first part of the module talks about the historical evidence for Jesus, things of that nature. But the whole second part of that module is on the Shroud of Turin with all the scientific experts embedded there. And that might be a good place for the kids to start. So you go to crediblecatholic.com, you just click on the 7 essential modules, then you go to module number 4, the one that's for the 12 plus. So just go for the one that's for the middle schoolers and the high schoolers, 12 plus, and then you can see there the experts as well. And of course, in the articles, in the scientific articles, I've got all the articles to all the peer-reviewed medical journals and optics journals and thermochemical journals.
Oh, that's so exciting. Thank you so much for that work. Please do yourself a favor and visit Credible Catholic and Marja Center. We've got all the links there and make the most of it. I am fascinated. I'm going to dive deeper in this topic because it sparked my conversion, and I'm falling more and more in love with our Lord, and the evidence of the shroud just really solidifies the faith there so much so. Is there, as we close, I just wanted to make, it could be as quick as a yes or a no. We don't have time to dive in, and that could be its own show, but there is claims, Divine Mercy image. Have you heard about the Divine Mercy image dimensions being exactly the same as the shroud? Have you heard about this sort of evidence?
I have, but the Divine Mercy image and other images have not been scientifically tested to the degree of the Shroud of Turin and the Facecloth of Ovido. The two really, really, really scientifically reliable ones are the Shroud of Turin and the Facecloth of Ovido. And so I have not really done studies on the other two because of Montpellier, the Divine Mercy image, simply because it's very difficult. And of course, the Divine Mercy image goes back to Saint
Faustina there,
Faustina
yes.
Kowalska, and it goes back to Saint Faustina Kowalska and not back to the time of Jesus. But there might be some really incredible parallels, because I do think definitely Saint Faustina was divinely inspired. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah, very fascinating. Thank you so much, Father. We are out of time. I wish I can keep going here, but I do encourage, again, everyone. I've mentioned this before. I've put it on the front cover of my testimony for a reason, the Shroud of Turin, and it's there, dead center. And I encourage, if you'd like to read this story, it's at perusiamedia.com, how Islam led me back to Christ. But very interestingly, how the Shroud of Turin, what appeared to me. Father, thank you so much. Can I ask, as we are in Lent right now, leading up to the resurrection, I think this will be unlike any other Easter for people after hearing these facts about the shroud. What just a final tip there, and then a blessing, please. Any just final things people can reflect on or help deepen their experience in Lent and leading up to Easter?
You bet. If you want, go to that article, the free article called Science in the Shroud of Turin, and zoom down to the section that's called The Blood Evidence and the Crucifixion of Jesus.
Mhm.
I think you will experience a crucifixion. Well, it's a very hard thing to read because this Jesus experienced so much pain, but it's all there in the detail, the number of whippings, the number of thorns, every detail that you could possibly want about the hands, the nails. So please go there. I know it sounds very gory and difficult, but in a way you'll appreciate what the Lord did to pay the penalty not only for our sins, but also that he mercifully gave rise to an unconditional act of love that would forgive us all. And please bow your heads and pray for God's blessing. And may the Lord of all consolation and reason, the Lord that brings together faith and reason, that brings together reason and revelation, bring you and endow you and inspire you with all of the evidence that he has left you, but also with all of the inspiration that he has given you interiorly about his existence and love for you through Jesus Christ, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Father Spitzer. God bless you. We are praying for you, praying for the great ministry and apostolate of the Martyr Center, and please pray for us at Parousia. And we're looking forward to getting you back on sometime down the track.
Absolutely.
God bless you.
God bless you too, Charbel.